Chairman.
Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now have great pleasure in introducing our after-dinner speaker. The Revd Canon Dr. Alistair Macdonald-Radcliff is the International Advisor to the Prayer Book Society of the USA on special projects. As you will hear shortly, he is not an American, but formed his connection with the American Prayer Book Society when he was studying at Yale, and he's also studied at Oxford and London. He's been the director of various bodies promoting international dialogue, in particular between Islam and the West. And he has also been Dean of All Saints Anglican Cathedral in Cairo. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for your very kind words of introduction. It's very much a great pleasure and indeed honour to have been invited thus to address so doughty an assembly as that of the Prayer Book Society in conference here. And having just returned from what I suppose one might call our late colonies in the Americas, once more pleasingly, I have to say, part of the Diocese of London, as Bishop Charters used rather often to remind me, I must of course bring you the warm greetings of our sister society, or your sister society, in the United States, which I have, as has been mentioned, the privilege to advise. When your invitation was first extended to me in a moment which I took to be of perhaps some mild desperation, it was explained that the conference theme was to be nothing less than the question, what has the Book of Common Prayer ever done for us? Powerfully redolent as that phrasing is, of course, of a celebrated scene enacted by that talented band of pantomime artists who confected Monty Python's Flying Circus. And you will therefore appreciate that it did create in me a moment of unease when I dwelt upon that connection, wondering as to quite what manner of divertissement you had in mind by producing on this occasion. But on further reflection, I put your chosen theme down to that streak of inner frivolity, which we now deduce to lurk within such seemingly sober figures as your company president, Prudence Daly, or indeed Daniel Newman. So in Daniel's case, while he's evidently standing in here, so to speak, for John Cleese, much as Prudence might in a sense be standing in for Brunella Scales, I should of course hasten to add, lest Daniel be the subject of reproach from that fearsome Kerberos Dr. Gatiss, that I'm not at all hereby suggesting that there's anything frivolous about the Church Society, which I know is another concern of his. Many things have been said, I think, about the Church Society, but accusing them of frivolity is not, I think. Getting back to that scene, what did the Romans ever do for us? Actually, in The Life of Brian, which is of course a film, just for the record, I deprecate, you may recall that it arose amidst a gathering, the scene is posed amidst a gathering of that memorably named institution known as the PFJ, namely the People's Front of Judea, whose members raised the question successively until, in exasperation, their unusually named, presumptively Arab leader, Reg, summarizes the situation thus: all right, but apart from sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? At which someone by the interesting name of Xerxes, with a gift for bad timing, says, well, they brought peace. It's the final coup de grace to the list. So clearly we are to deduce the point that some parallel suggests itself with the Book of Common Prayer, in that our cultural debts to it are too little known and insufficiently acknowledged, while also willfully pushed aside by the growing forces of secularism. Which is why you added, I presume, the rider to the theme of the conference, which raises the question rhetorically of why we still need the prayer book, since by implication it is fundamental if we are to sustain the benefits it has offered down the centuries, in doing so much to shape the Church of England specifically, as well as our wider culture and our very language itself. So with such grand themes ahead of us, and in an effort, of course, to build rapport, which I'm advised you should do, both with congregations and audiences, I thought I would get ahead of where your minds will be going at this point, And naturally that made me think of Friedrich Nietzsche on the one hand and Euripides on the other. Not forgetting with appropriate sensitivity, of course, to gender balance, the dramatic figures of Antigone and Medea. And of course you're entirely right, and I'm glad that we're of one mind in thinking this way. But at the risk of what the Greeks would have called anticlimax, allow me to put aside the prospect of those Elysian fields, if only for a moment, and look instead at two domains that offer a caution to those who would neglect the prayer book, and in the context of our church, and the prayer book's traditional role in defining who we are as Anglicans. The one aspect is sharply practical, if burdensome, and the other is conceptual, and a pitfall about what it means in terms of character to be Anglican. Moreover, before I dash too readily to classical sources, one has to be mindful that one can actually go too far down that path. Harder that may be for some of us to imagine, but looked at historically, it is cautionary to recall the case of the West Country priest in the 19th century, who was so persuaded by the virtues of Neoplatonism that he felt compelled to slaughter an ox and offer it as a sacrifice to Jupiter. As one thinks about his case, of course, in a postmodern church that finds it ever harder to draw any boundaries, perhaps there are places now where he would fit right in. Provided, of course, that he sacrificed the ox in an appropriately caring manner, was both ecologically sound and, despite the possible flames required for the incineration, carbon neutral. And again, on the subject of animals and the church, coming as I do from a congregation periodically enlarged by the attendance of a very fine parrot by the name of Sebastian, I think too of the Victorian clergyman who kept 9 cats and brought them all to church, a model, as we would now say, of interspecial inclusivism. All apparently went well until one cat committed the grave transgression of catching a mouse. That wasn't in itself an error, but he did it on Sunday. And faced with so egregious a case of breaking the Sabbath, something which my Presbyterian forebears would have understood very well, the cleric felt he had no choice but formally to excommunicate the feline, as he did. This latter action would again, obviously, be felt not merely eccentric, but rather excessively judgmental, I think, nowadays, and clearly speciesist and exclusionary. But I digress. To be more serious for a moment here, the first distraction of those 2 strands that I wanted to mention from the prayer book model is that of the administrative church. Here I think first about the rise of a corporate model of the church and the consequent belief that the best leadership will be managerial, or to put this in terms of an earlier age, service and administration, as covered by the Greek word hyporesis. Take, for example, the questionnaire I was recently shown that was sent out to applicants for a parish rector post. I was asked for suggestions for the answers, which I shall take the liberty of sharing, of course. While many questions were actually perfectly straightforward and sensible, they did not entirely all seem to be that way. Consider the first introduction, which read, "Considering your answers to the questions in your Office for Transitional Ministry database portfolio, please expand on the following. If asked for a portrait of yourself, what would you say?" Now, of course, I wasn't quite sure what they meant, but in giving advice, it was simple enough. I suggested it would probably be either in acrylic or oils, personally. In the modern context of the church, probably something in watercolour would be safer. Though in any case, it should be, as I also pointed out, with keeping in mind that we are very indebted to the psychologists nowadays, very heavy on the superego and light on the id. A Jungian vernacular was preferred, something with minimal shadow and not too much chiaroscuro. But the candidate, however, felt something more narrative in form was called for. So trying to think creatively, I was thinking of what he might use and suggested that the opening lines of that very fine volume of autobiography, supposed, entitled Augustus Carp, Esquire by Himself, which has the subtitle, Being the Autobiography of a Really Good Man, good effect. And in our increasingly earnest world, the satirical intent of its actual author, Sir Henry Howard Bashford, we can be sure will be entirely overlooked. A short paragraph can perhaps convey something of the fine quality and tone which I felt would be so helpful to the application, and I quote, "It is customary, I have noticed, in publishing an autobiography, to preface it with some sort of apology. But there are times, and surely the present is one of them, when to do so is manifestly unnecessary. When every standard of decent conduct has either been torn down or is threatened with destruction, when quite young girls smoke cigarettes and even, I'm assured, sometimes cigars, when mature women, the mothers of unhappy children, enter the sea in one-piece bathing costumes, and when married men, the heads of households, prefer the flicker of the cinematograph to the Athanasian Creed, then it is obviously a task not to be justifiably avoided, to place some higher example before the world. For some time I had been feeling this with increasing urgency, and I felt the delay would amount to sin. That sin by many persons is now lightly regarded, I am of course only too well aware. That its very existence is denied by others is a fact equally familiar to me, but I am not one of them. On every ground I am an unflinching opponent of sin, I have continually rebuked it in others, I have strictly refrained from it myself, and have for that reason alone, I have therefore deemed it incumbent upon me to issue this volume. I thought that could surely commend any candidate to a parish. How would you describe your spiritual gifts, and the one that seems most evident, and how have you validated your discernment? I suggested if they wanted one word, a good one to use would be abundant. If one had to single out one, then it would probably be humility. The sense of enrichment others have always identified after engagement with one would surely be the ideal way of validation. 4. How would you describe your leadership style? Please name 2 alternative styles and identify any negative areas. Again, I thought of a single word to propose for the candidate, and it would be magnificent. I then noted that it divides between inspirational and encouraging, and in terms of a downside, I suggested if there had to be one, it was simply that others could feel depressed and discouraged by one's success. It feels called to reach out to such unfortunate in an especially loving way. Given that management, he then asked, is different from leadership, in for very subtle distinctions, the casuistry tradition lives on, how would you define your administrative skills in terms of our question A, B, and C? Where the interesting part was that they didn't give the questions A, B, and C. So again, in a one-word answer, I suggested it would be safe to suggest geometric. As an enthusiastic devotee of all those diagrams of that very good, pious Anglican, the Reverend Dr. Venn, which represent propositions, as he put it himself, by means of inclusive and exclusive circles, could there be anything that sounded more Anglican? I would say there is a lot of B in my A, and while A and B both engage C. That seemed to be a useful answer. Next came the describe how you successfully managed conflict and approached the running of meetings. Answer, I suggested would be, I build consensus remorselessly until everyone agrees with me. As the saying goes, in matters controversial, my judgment's rather fine. I see both points of view, the one that's wrong and mine. Please illustrate, then this gets much more complicated, your leadership in worship. Now, while safety nowadays, I suppose, would probably lie in suggesting that one subscribed to the new every morning liturgical exploration of new riches and common worship, one could simply be direct and say, of course, one used the Book of Common Prayer. But of course, the parishes were more probing in this regard. So they suggested that a video demonstrating the applicant, as they put it, displaying leadership in liturgy and in the act of preaching, so to speak, in flagrante dedicto, would be This led, in at least one case, therefore, to the retaining of a professional video team to record the celebrant at the following Sunday's High Mass, replete with his sermon. Given the theatrical splendour of the church involved and the forces available by way of servers and acolytes, one was of course left to surmise that the result would be somewhere between, I suppose, a Cecil B. DeMille production of Ben-Hur and a performance of Placido Domingo at the Metropolitan Opera. The sermon no doubt possessed of the authority of Charlton Heston as Moses presenting the Ten Commandments, preceded of course by a dramatic reenactment, so to speak, of the parting of the Red Sea as the Gospel was made in procession. But anyway, I digress. But before getting, and you're wanting, I know, to hear more about Nietzsche and Euripides, but before getting back to them, you might usefully consider one other dimension of the modern church, which brings me to a vexing conceptual issue, for Anglicans at least, and Episcopalians. One of the engaging things about being an Anglican, of which there are many as we know, is that it evidently involves not only, as we heard this morning, good taste, but also being nice, which is to say being, to use the definition of the dictionaries, pleasing, agreeable, delightful, amiable, pleasant, and kind. Now, I'm sure you will all, only to hear those words, to recognise yourselves in them, even though I have to concede that there are those who are so contumacious and curmudgeonly as to point out that niceness, as a purely technical matter, isn't actually a virtue. But in a spirit of historical inquiry, it is tempting at least to ask when our niceness as Anglicans set in. I can give no definitive answer, but I can perhaps offer what is by way of some pointers out there in terms of research. After all, niceness is not perhaps the most obvious term one might use, for example, in seeking to capture the general tenor of the Reformation. At least if there is an account of it that opens with the phrase, "The Reformation began with an excess of niceness," I have yet to read it. Would be that other possibility, which does have textual precedence to do with the superfluity of naughtiness in the Epistle of James. Then again, as the likes of Stephen Pinker in The Better Angels of Our Nature has pointed out, if one looks across a very broad sweep of history, it would seem that by and large, people nowadays are less inclined to, at least in the West, embrace cruelty as entertainment, human sacrifice or pogrom as outlets for frustration, and homicide as the usual form of conflict resolution, at least outside of the Middle East. But anyway, so there is perhaps some basis for supposing that we moderns in the West are nicer than we once were. Although I am a touch suspicious that this may reflect too ready an embrace of the charming if deeply problematic belief in the inevitability of progress, which so many seem to uphold since the Enlightenment. But in any case, none of this would seem to get at anything that is, as it were, an Anglican Episcopal distinctive. Happily, though, someone has, of course, taken the trouble to write an engaging history of at least American niceness, which along the way points out that Americans self-identify as nice to a degree only exceeded internationally by Canadians. On the subject, American niceness, a cultural history, Carity Brahmin argues that the concept was reformulated in its modern sense in America, and is thus quintessentially North American, and thus the quintessential gift of the North American Church to the rest of us. Whereas she writes, the word itself changed as it crossed the pond. It had meant precise, but we Americans recast it as pleasing, valuing pleasantry over exactitude. Such slang was quintessentially American, rejecting precise but outdated English compulsions and manners. But one important thread of thought in her study is the implicit regulative role the concept has. This means that being nice has never really been a neutral term. It always carries an implicit agenda. And that points to the sense in which Anglicanism has embraced not only niceness, but a far more telling concept, namely moderation and reasonableness, as recurring features of its self-understanding. And I suggest that this has contrasting consequences in different domains. On the one hand, as a social concept, it's important to recognize the dangers in such self-understanding, if it is allowed to pass under-examined, for taken together with the key matter of who determines the contents and boundaries of niceness and reasonableness and moderation as a group distinctive, we have arrived at a force that can in fact privilege some and be coercive of others. Those who are identified as falling outside this cosy and agreeable domain are what in the ancient world the Romans would have immediately recognized, namely barbarians. This means that much of this rhetoric, while seemingly being about what we might in contemporary language call inclusion and embrace, is actually just as much about exclusion and rejection, and this needs to be acknowledged. On the other hand, the intellectual posture of reasonableness in terms of philosophical positioning has definitely assisted Anglican Christians, I think, in speaking effectively to our contemporary and increasingly aggressive secular culture. And there's a long history to this, going back to Paley as well as, of course, to Locke, but most especially to my mind Bishop Butler, famous for two aphorisms, which I can't dwell on, that enthusiasm is a very horrid thing, and probability is the very guide of life. But insofar as the posture of reasonableness has assisted us in gaining access to the public square, this raises another danger too, that in seeking to retain a place in the public square, the Church will be tempted to accommodate itself too much to the external and secular agenda. For a radical, if colourful critique, we have only to look to some of the writings of the Puritans who were particularly concerned to oppose what was known from Scripture as lukewarmness. Consequent upon just this, and most especially when found in bishops, where they clearly thought it was a woeful norm. Thus we find Milton, for example, writing with rather colourful prose at the beginning of his work of Reformation, and I quote, "And it is still episcopacy that before all our eyes worsens and slugs the most learned, and seemingly religious of our ministers, who no sooner advance to it, but like a seething pot, set to cool, sensibly exhale and wreak out the greatest part of that zeal and those gifts which were formerly in them, settling in a skinny congealment of ease and sloth at the top. And if they keep their learning by some potent sway of nature, 'tis a rare chance, but their devotion most commonly comes to that queasy temper of lukewarmness that gives a vomit to God himself." As you see, he was not always restrained in his language. In sharp opposition to this charge of lukewarmness was the bugaboo charge, of course, of which goes back to the Greek, enthusiasmos, giving rise to the term, of course, enthusiasm, coming to indicate the delusion or imposture of those who falsely believed or professed that they are or have been possessed by the Spirit. One of the finest historians of this subject was the late Monsignor Ronald Knox, in his most enduring academic work of that very title. There he carefully explained enthusiasm as labelling a tendency to seek and expect extraordinary graces in the form of more evident results from the grace of God than those for which the traditional Christian can hope, and explains that the assumption of the enthusiast is bolder and simpler. For him, grace has destroyed nature and replaced it. Especially he decries the use of human reason as a guide to any sort of religious truth. Always the enthusiast hankers after a theocracy in which the righteous bear rule openly. All of which frames, of course, the infamous tombstone inscription commending the priest who had served his maker for 50 years without the smallest sign of enthusiasm. Ethan Chagin, in his relatively recent book, The Rule of Moderation, has further argued on these themes that moderation was to become central to a key part of English history and identity, and a profoundly coercive tool of social and religious and political power, which peaked at times when the state was at its most intolerant. A very dramatic example being when Henry VIII, at one particular point, executed in 1 month 3 Protestants and 3 Catholics in the cause of making sure that moderation was pursued. In philosophical terms, the concept moved from its partial origins in an Aristotelian mean of moderation in being used to disclose a virtuous ethos for those in power, and to denigrate contrasting, even invented, extremes. And thus, to use the terms of Foucault, which is much more modern, moderation became an emerging ideology of power and a means of authorization for public action. This becomes particularly powerful when conjoined with the later concept of public reason, which seeks to meet a particular challenge once heavy weight is put upon freedom. For if each of us is free in the sense of not being naturally subject to any other person's moral, political, or other authority, how can some moral or political rules be rightly imposed on all of us, particularly if we assume deep and permanent disagreement among persons about matters of value, morality, religion, and the good life? The answer for proponents of public reason is that such rules can rightly be imposed on persons, this is option 1, when the rules can be justified by appeal to ideas or arguments that those persons themselves, at some level of idealization, endorse or accept, or, more restrictively, are deemed to be justified only by appeal to suitably shared or public considerations. For example, widely endorsed political values such as freedom and equality, even though I would argue they are ultimately opposed, with the usual implied requirement to abstain then from appealing to religious arguments or to other controversial views over which reasonable people are assumed to disagree. A move which can also allow the complete sidestepping, we need to notice, of the question of truth. This has the consequence of rendering positively embarrassing a typical claim of many religions to the possession of truths not otherwise available in the moral domain. Given the implicit presumption of many secularists that religion, by its very nature, participates in the irrational, I'd say that is an increasingly dominant perspective. In such a thought world, the temptation is to reduce religion to the domain of what can be generally allowed to advance the common good, or, in practical terms, what I'm tempted to call religion within the limits of Millennium Goals alone, and must inexorably increase. And that, of course, I think is a point where we might perhaps think about Nietzsche and Euripides after all. Nietzsche introduces an intellectual dichotomy between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, which I can loosely define as realities disordered and undifferentiated by forms, the Dionysian, versus reality as ordered and differentiated by forms. Thus, for some people, I've heard it suggested that those people who wave their hands in the air and look at screens in liturgy are inclining to the Dionysian. And thus the tragedy of ancient Greece as the highest form of art. Thus, this sees then, in the case of Nietzsche, the tragedy of ancient Greece, the tragic tradition in its theatre, as the highest form of art, owing to its mixture of both Apollonian and Dionysian elements into one seamless whole, allowing the spectator to experience the full spectrum of the human condition. However, there is a point here which I think is very well brought out by George Steiner, which ultimately means, the point he makes here is that true tragedy, however, requires a universe of real, which is to say transcendent meaning, which is why it is plausible to argue that in a postmodern universe, where the possibility of such meaning is effectively denied, we arrive ultimately not merely with Fukuyama at the end of history, but, I would argue with Steiner, at the end of tragedy as well. And I'll leave that point to one side, but it is one that I think is important to dwell upon. The tragedy itself is a pointer to transcendent meaning. But aside from all of that, it's interesting, there's one other point I'll just touch on, which is it is of interest to note that when Protagoras delivered his first public lecture in Athens, entitled On the Gods, an anecdote tells us that he met his audience in the house of Euripides. Protagoras began his presentation famously with a confession of agnosticism, claiming that he was unable to say anything with precision about the gods, even to the point whether they exist or do not exist, or what they are like. Many things, he explained, impair human ability to comprehend them, the gods' obscurity and the brevity of our lives, which thus, in his view, entail a humility about what we can say. I will venture the thought, without pressing it too much, that we have perhaps had something of our own Protagoran experience with, of course, the perspective of Sir Roger Scruton. But the larger point of interest is the obscurity we face in trying to understand the function and meaning of gods in Euripides' tragedies. I will explain to you why that comes to be of relevance and what it has to tell us today. One thing that does seem clear is that the ultimate deity in an Aristotelian cosmos has no need of support or service. Hyperesia, that term that I used at the beginning. What exactly is meant by the notion of hyperesia being rejected here? On a superficial level, the idea seems to be straightforward. Due to his supreme power, the supreme god does not need any assistance whatsoever. This is in sharp distinction with the Homeric gods, who help one another, forge alliances, and so forth, and look thus rather human. But supposing we compare that kind of picture, and now look at Sophocles' Antigone. According to the venerable Greek customs, the subterranean deities demand that the dead be buried. In covering her brother Polynices with dust, Antigone not only observes the customary ritual, but also, and more importantly, fashions herself into a human instrument of the gods, and defies the political powers that be. Her self-sacrifice becomes a symbol of the highest expression of service to a religious cause, and what we see here may be described as a striking example of humility, such as one might cite in Thucydides' portrait of Nicias, etc., but of hyperesia. Euripides' Medea was then written sometime afterwards, but also places, of course, famously a towering female character in the limelight. Whatever we may now feel in the 21st century about the morality of Medea's conduct, she's a woman who has been described as one who transcends the confines of human powerlessness, takes the rightful and from a divine standpoint necessary project of revenge into her own hands. This means that Medea is both authentically herself, while at the same time acting in obedience to a divine command, punishing where the gods would punish, and with the same superhuman harshness which ultimately, of course, deforms and denies her humanity. This unity of Medea with the gods is critical, for Medea makes utterly clear that she understands herself as acting together with and on behalf of the gods. The famous line, "The gods and I are responsible." What we encounter as a dramatic subtext in this play is thus the concept of piety as hyperesia, that is to say, a willing and active service rendered to the gods and the moral code they stand for, irrespective of the crushing magnitude of the immediate consequences. Both Antigone and Medea ascend of their own accord to the level of human instruments to a divine cause, and thereby remain true to their moral or religious convictions, even and especially in circumstances of adversity. Yet for all this might sound in some sense commendable, there is also something dangerously ambiguous here. The hyperesia can lead a person to feats of extraordinary nobility and beauty, perhaps, but it's just as likely to result in the utter destruction and negation of specifically human relationships and values, with the more fundamental problem being the conceptual incoherence, this is the crux of the matter, in positing a God who needs human help. How could such a being still be considered a God in the full sense of the word? That is the rub. All of which brings us back, as you will have realized already, to the Anglican Church. For we can see all too clearly a primrose path before us, where it might seek to define itself as worthy of its place in public life because of its good works and services to the gods of our time, namely the state and community. To go down the path of becoming thus a hyperetic church is ultimately going to end badly. It is to repeat the path of tragedy and embrace, I would argue, at its extreme, the hamartia central to that fate. Moreover, it's ultimately to embrace a form of salvation by works, which is deeply inimical to the prayer book and the theology it sets out. Ours is a faith which, to use a rather clumsy jargon, is not comprised of orthopraxis, but of orthodoxy, by which we derive access to the salvation made available to each of us once for all through the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus Christ. With that said, we do well to heed, I think, the sentiment expressed right back on the morning of June the 23rd, 1870, directly following the formal dedication of Keble College by the then Chancellor of the University, Lord Salisbury, who presided over the proceedings. The theological stance he then sketched is surely one far more consistent with the Anglican and prayer book tradition, which I think we all seek to maintain. As he went on to state, I think this college exists to pledge us to a religion which shall not be the formless, shapeless creature of fable, such as goes by the name of unsectarian religion, but shall be unsectarian in the higher sense, because it is thoroughly Catholic, which he means universal, and that there shall be no more within these walls the idea of severing religion and dogma than there is the idea of severing the daylight from the sun. So, having said all that, when you summarize these proceedings to your impatient friends and relations, you will be able to say that our evening peregrinations, as befits our location in the Royal Agricultural University, featured 1 ox sacrificed to Jupiter, 1 mouse, 9 cats, of which 1 was excommunicated, and all that was long before we took in Nietzsche, Euripides, Antigone, and Medea, in illustration of the perils of substituting a hyperetic for a prayer book church. Then, of course, in the finest tradition of Monty Python, we must not forget our one parrot by the name of Sebastian.
Thank you very much indeed for that contribution, which was both erudite and entertaining. And as somebody who has recently been involved in interviewing for a new vicar, I now know what it would have looked like if one of the applicants had been a cross between Obadiah Slope and Stephen Fry.